It's the fall of 1592. Winter is coming on, and Hideyoshi's invasion of Korea isn't going too well. His forward units are in Seoul and Pyongyang, waiting for reinforcements and supplies to be ferried up through the Yellow Sea so that they can proceed on to China. But those reinforcements and supplies, they're not coming. Down on the south coast, the Korean Navy under IMJIN has blocked the way to the Yellow Sea. A supply route by ship can't be established. The advance into China has therefore ground to a halt. So, had this whole thing been a pipe dream? Had Hideyoshi's plan to conquer China been doomed to fail from the start? Had he been crazy to even imagine that he could do such a thing? Or, if events had unfolded differently, if Hideyoshi's navy had established a Yellow Sea supply route, if his forward units had been reinforced, might his plan have succeeded? Could his forces have gone all the way to Beijing? Could they have dethroned the Ming Emperor, beaten Chinese armies, and taken over China? Let's talk about that. So, could Hideyoshi actually have conquered China? Yes. It was a long shot, but his invasion could have succeeded. His armies could have reached Beijing and taken over China and totally changed the course of history. Here are some things to consider. Number 1. The precedent of Spanish conquistadors in the New World. In 1519, Hernan Cortes landed on the coast of Mexico with just 500 men and ended up conquering the entire Aztec civilization. An empire of 5 million people, with armies totaling in the hundreds of thousands, conquered by just 500 highly motivated men. Okay, so the Spanish had horses and a few cannons, and the Aztecs had never seen such things. Cortes recruited local tribes to join him, etc., etc. None of that changes the underlying fact that sometimes a very small group of people can effect a very big change. If Cortes and his men had been defeated, we'd be nodding our heads now and saying, yeah, Cortes was crazy, pure hubris. Why did he ever think he could conquer the New World with just 500 men? But he did. The lesson? Sometimes the course of history turns on a very small hinge. That's number 1. Now, to get more into specifics, number 2. Ming Chinese military weakness. We tend to be blinded by China's huge size and huge population into assuming that it must have had a massive army. It didn't. By the late 16th century, Ming Chinese military might existed mostly on paper, in hopelessly outdated and falsified muster rolls that listed as many as 1 million men. In reality, the Ming could scrape up barely 1/10 of that number. This 1/10 also wasn't in a single mass. It wasn't a cohesive army. With such a large country to protect, it was scattered all over, separate units thousands of kilometers apart. In terms of Ming China's ability to field an actual army, consider the force it finally did scrape together and send to Korea. It numbered just 35,000 men. Compare that to Hideyoshi's invasion force. Hideyoshi started out with 158,800 men. Next, and finally, number 3. It took the Ming Chinese a very long time to mobilize its armed forces to respond to a threat. Following the start of the IMJIN War, for example, it took Beijing more than 2 months simply to awaken to the threat posed by the Japanese army marching up through Korea and to issue the order mobilizing Ming China's armed forces. A relatively small army of 5,000 men was sent to Uiju in August to protect the Korean king, Sunjo, but this was nowhere near enough to stop the Japanese. It wouldn't be until January 1593, more than 7 months into the war, that a larger army of 35,000 would be ready to march into Korea. The Japanese, meanwhile, were the opposite of slow. There was probably no army anywhere in the world that was faster. As we saw in episode 3, Konishi Yukinaga's first contingent marched from Pusan to Seoul, 450 kilometers, on foot in just 20 days. Kato Kiyomasa's men did it in 15 days. That's 30 kilometers per day. The Japanese were amazingly fast. This is perhaps the most important factor to consider when we're pondering alternate outcomes to the IMJIN War, Japanese speed versus Ming Chinese slowness. Okay, so let's roll the clock back to the start of the war and play this thing out. An alternate history. It's June 1592. Japanese ships are probing west along Korea's south coast, and there's no Korean Navy to stop them. There's no Isun Shin. So these Japanese ships, they enter the Yellow Sea, and they start ferrying men and supplies north to Seoul and Pyongyang as per the plan. So Konishi Yukinaga, Kato Kiyomasa, Kuroda Nagamasa, their advanced contingents in the north are brought back to nearly full strength, and they continue their northward advance. From Pyongyang to the Yalu River, it's only another 250 kilometers, so they get there by late August. They find only 5,000 Chinese troops at Uiju, guarding King Sunjo. The first 3 contingents of Hideyoshi's army alone, even without reinforcements, is 5 times larger than this. So the Chinese are smashed, and King Sunjo flees Korea altogether, never to return. Now, from the Yalu River onto Beijing is something like 850 kilometers. That's a pretty long walk. But the Japanese don't need to walk it. They can use their ships. The Yellow Sea isn't like the open ocean, after all. It's shallow, it's relatively placid, much safer for ferrying around men and supplies. So they cross the Yellow Sea in their ships and land on the Chinese coast within a 3-day march of Beijing. That puts them outside the walls of the Ming capital by late September 1592. Even sooner if they bypass the Yalu and sail across the Yellow Sea direct from Pyongyang. Either way, the Chinese are caught completely off guard. There's panic in the city. The Wanli Emperor and his court flee. Government troops stationed in the capital region put up a desperate fight, but they're outnumbered and they're defeated. Konishi and Kato fight for the glory of being the first into the now deserted Forbidden City. Kato wins the race by mere minutes. He enters the Hall of Supreme Harmony, mounts the dais, and sits on the celestial throne, testing it out for his master, Hideyoshi. Kato is there, sitting and smiling, when Konishi bursts in. Sound improbable? Well, think about this. In 1555, a band of pirate raiders aboard 1 or 2 ships landed on the coast of China and went on a looting spree inland. They pillaged all around the city of Nanjing, leaving a swath of destruction more than 1,000 kilometers long and killing or wounding almost 4,000 people. The government's muster rolls claimed that there were 120,000 soldiers garrisoned in the region. But this turned out to be a gross exaggeration. The true number was closer to 0. It ended up taking the Chinese 80 days to stop these renegades, nearly 3 months for the great might of Ming China to rouse itself to stop what in the end was estimated to be just 60 or 70 men. The idea of conquering Ming China, Hideyoshi wasn't the only one to have it. Down in the Philippines, at the Spanish colony of Manila, the Spanish had been thinking about doing the same thing for years. In the next episode, we're going to be looking at this interesting sidebar to the IMJIN War, the Spanish plan to conquer China. That's coming up next. In the meantime, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. And if you've already subscribed, thank you. See you next time.